When I was 28 years old, my life changed forever. I became a mother. And I looked at my new baby daughter and I thought, how will I teach her about this world and her place in it? And when my oldest daughter was just a few months old, I had this vivid, recurring dream. And in the dream, I'm holding my tiny, helpless baby in my arms. And there's a storm raging all around us. Rain is pouring down. Floodwaters are rising. There's thunder and lightning, and there's a flood coming right at us. And I think, how will I do this? How will I protect her? I guess you could say I was feeling just a little bit overwhelmed by the responsibilities of parenting. But my husband and I soon became comfortable with those responsibilities. In fact, we became so comfortable that we decided to have 2 more daughters. And life was rolling along, and we thought, you know what? I think we've got this parenting thing figured out. So you know what happens next, right? Because as soon as you think you've got it figured out in parenting, as in life, something comes along that changes everything. And for me, that happened when my oldest daughter turned 7. She became what media and marketing creators call a tweenager, which means that she was no longer considered a child. And suddenly, there was a real flood in our lives. And it was coming straight at her. A flood of images, a flood of stories, a flood of narratives. And these messages struck at the very core of what my husband and I have been trying to teach our daughter about who she was and who she could become. And as a parent, as a mother, as a woman, as a psychology professional, this disturbed me greatly. And so, like all good professors do, I decided to research it. And I've spent the last 9 years trying to answer this question: does sexy media matter? I've read hundreds and thousands of research articles and journals and books. And I've also conducted my own research. So I've collected surveys from hundreds of adolescents. I've conducted interviews with children and adolescents. I've done experimental studies. And the whole time, I've been trying to answer 2 pieces of this question. The first part is, has media really changed? Because I thought, you know what, maybe it's just that I'm a parent. And so it looks different to me now than it did when I was younger. And then the second question I have is, does it matter? Does this flood of messages have an effect on the children that are growing up being overwhelmed by them? And so, in my research, I discovered something called sexualization. This is what I identified as the main problem. Sexualization is the idea that a person's primary value comes from their sexuality. It's a very, very narrow way of looking at what makes someone worthy. For boys, this often looks like being a sexual aggressor. And so they want to have as many romantic and sexual partners as possible. For girls, this often looks like being a sexual object and wanting to attract as many romantic and sexual partners as possible. I think it's really important here that I point out that sexualization on one hand is very different than healthy sexual development, on the other hand. Healthy sexual development is something that we need to be talking to children about as they're growing, and it focuses on things like mutuality and respect and consent. The key to kind of understanding the difference between these two things is understanding that healthy sexual development sees a person's sexuality as just one component of a complex human being, whereas sexualization focuses on a person's sexuality to the exclusion of everything else. And so I had answered one question, which was that, okay, media has changed and it has become more sexualized. So my next question was, what are the effects on children and adolescents who are growing up with this? And I found 3 key areas of impact. These are body image, self-concept, and sexual behaviors. Through the use of computer imaging and makeup and lighting, every single image that you see in the media and marketing has been manipulated in some way. We've set this ideal standard for what people should look like, and it's so high that in fact, people who are famous for being physically attractive, like models and actors, they can't even meet that standard. And so they also are airbrushed and photoshopped. I was talking about this idea one day with a group of adolescents, and this guy says, okay, wait a minute. He pulled out a magazine we'd been looking at, and he points at this woman in the ad, and he said, so she's not real. This person doesn't exist. And I said, that's right. This was a startling revelation for him. And yet, how many young people consume this media every day, and they hold that ideal standard up and they look at it and they think, I wish I looked like that, without realizing that that person doesn't even look like that in real life. In fact, we know from the research that mass media has an impact on body dissatisfaction for both young women and for young men. The next area is self-concept. Now, I told you earlier that sexualization says the most important thing about you is your sexuality. So, children who grow up consuming a lot of this kind of media, instead of getting the message that says, it's important for you to be kind, it's important for you to be caring, it's important for you to use your gifts and your strengths to make this world a better place. Instead of hearing that, what they're hearing is, it's important for you to be sexy. And as a psychologist, I have to say, this is not a healthy message. The last area of impact is sexual behaviors. And what we see is that media directed at teenagers has changed in that it depicts more incidences of sexual behaviors in casual ways, not in relationships. And it also depicts more risky sexual behaviors. So things like not using contraception, like having multiple partners, like not talking about consent as a part of a relationship. And the research tells us that the more of this kind of media that children and adolescents consume, the more of those risky sexual behaviors they tend to engage in themselves. So I found and identified this problem of sexualization and sexualized media. And then I saw, okay, there are 3 key areas that are being impacted. And I wanted to know next, so what do we do about this? How do we help kids learn to be critical, engaged consumers instead of passive consumers? And as I did, I kept coming back to some of the interviews that I had done with the teenagers that I had talked to, because I realized there was this group of kids that weren't showing these negative impacts. In fact, they were critical, engaged consumers. They were dealing with this pressure and this challenge of sexualized media in a really effective way. And so I wanted to know what was different about those kids that when they faced a challenge like sexualized media, they were able to flourish instead of flounder. And to discover what that was, I went into the area of positive psychology, and especially an area called positive youth development. Positive youth development studies what makes children thrive. And as I looked at that, I realized that these 5 C's of thriving that they talk about in positive youth development were exactly the kinds of things that I was hearing from the kids who were being able to deal with the challenge of sexualized media in an effective way. So let's talk about those 5 C's and how does that look when we're applying it to sexualized media. The first thing we want to think about is competence. Competence is just feeling like you can do something well that's important. We already said that sexualized media tells us what's most important is that we're sexy. So we need to send a different message. We need to help children see that it's important for them to know what their gifts are and how to use those to make a difference in the world, to be kind and caring. We want them to have a different understanding of value than that message that's being sent. The second thing we want to do is build their confidence in engaging with this kind of media. So you know what that means. It means in a developmentally appropriate way, we're not always going to be screening them from this. We're going to give them opportunities to engage a piece of media, usually with us as the parent, the first time, and to talk about it. We want them to understand what is the message that's being sent here. We want them to understand and critique that message and say, you know what? What do I think about that message? And then we want them to have chances to act. And the way they can act is doing things like talking to a store manager when they see unhealthy messages, writing to a media creator. Maybe they even do something like write a blog post or start a petition or record a video and share that on social media. Being able to do that will help them build their confidence as critical, engaged consumers. We also need to talk about character. Character is understanding the difference between right and wrong. And the way we do this with sexualized media is we hold up those messages that are being sent and we say, what kind of worldview is being expressed in this piece of media? And how does that compare to your own worldview? And that leaves that child the opportunity to say, you know what? I'm not buying that message. I don't think that's right. And then the last thing that we need to do is make sure that kids are a part of connected, caring communities. Now, these communities can be anything. It might be a sports team, it might be a church group, it might be a service organization, but the important thing is that it's a place where there's positive experiences. It's a place where there's some kind of value other than sexualization that's being promoted, so it might be teamwork or it might be service. And then lastly, it needs to be a place where they're building connections and they're really engaging with the other people in the community. Kids who have these 5 C's are able to face challenges like sexualized media, and they're able to thrive, and they're able to deal with them effectively. But it's not just children and adolescents who struggle with these negative media messages, is it? I mean, every single one of us in this audience has probably at times felt overwhelmed by these kinds of messages. I want to tell you something. Sexualized media is not inevitable. When we, as consumers, are willing to use our voices and speak up, they are powerful. When we are willing to show our competence and our confidence by critically engaging with media makers, when we're willing to show our character by standing up and speaking out against unhealthy messages, when we're willing to come together as a community and say no more with both our dollars and our voices, we will be heard. And we will not only be critical, engaged consumers, we will be world changers. Because when we are willing and able to push and ask for better, media and marketing creators will do better. I want to leave you with this quote from Margaret Mead, and it's a call to action. I hope that you will join me in the fight against sexualized media. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you.